how are we actually going to get to ground to understand if an entity that we're doing business with in China has any exposure to forced labor risk in the Uyghur region. And it's creating a huge amount of internal work for organizations to do that. And we really think this is a trend that's just going to continue.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're back for another show of SimplyTrade, and we are going to have a good discussion today. But as we're going through this, I will say that, man, I know it's like a broken record, Lila. I keep saying this. Man, I tell you, I am just amazed on the activity on LinkedIn for us. We do appreciate y'all reaching out to us and trying to connect with Lalo and myself, and as well as the show and all that. But anyway, it's as things are progressing, and as we're looking at this is a good time of the year for us. And so, Lalo, how are you doing, my friend?
Doing pretty good, and just keeping an eye as we approach the end of the year here, and everybody just going around crazy. Just seems like everyone has just decided to, thank goodness for us, right? I guess, but to spend some of their budget and trying to keep us busy and engaged, which is really good. Thank you all for your business as well. And but yeah, I mean, we're looking at hopefully starting 2024 here with a bunch of exciting, cool stuff. And by the way, I see you're donning your it's not a Stetson, is it? Or is it your Larry Mahan?
This is by Larry Mahan on I have today. So, folks, I had been running around early this morning before we got online. And so I had my hat on and I came running in. I set everything up, and so here I am, and I probably have hat hair underneath it because I've just
so it's too late to take it off. You can't take it off.
Yeah, I'm just leaving it on. So if you get to you hear us, but if you want to see what this looks like, you can go to our the video portion with the YouTube and the
YouTube. Yeah, exactly. Go to our YouTube channel, and yeah. So my dad, I don't know if you knew this. My dad was he worked for Larry Mahan. He was a handcrafter. He made boots by hand for Larry Mahan back in the day, and his specialty was to, all those cool little fancy designs and strings and everything that go on the tube of the boot and on the just regular leather boots, not the fancy stuff. But so yeah, he used to design stuff like that and make all those real cool designs and everything. But anyway, he did that for Larry Mahan and Tony Lama. So anyway, just fun fact there. Yeah. But anyway, okay, but today's episode, Andy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. We are continuing in a series here, and excuse me, that time of year where I get choked up at times. Anyway, we are continuing a series here with some folks from Descartes, and with that, well, I say some folks, is a gentleman we've had on, Jackson Wood. Jackson is been extremely knowledgeable and a great guest on for our first one. This is our second in the series. So we're going to get talking about, like, basically, I guess, as we were saying off camera here, Jackson, is that, a little bit of regulatory affairs, a little bit of sourcing, a little bit of collaboration within a company, and kind of in today's world, how things have changed a little bit, and kind of with the change of the government's approach on identifying the, if you will, the bad folks to do business with in the industries and all of that. Would that be a good, fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so, and great to be back with you, Andy and Lalo, and all of your listeners. It was a lot of fun for our first conversation. So I'm happy to pick the ball up here and dig a little deeper on some of the concepts we explored in our initial episode. And so just to maybe set the stage for us a little bit, we ended our first conversation with this notion of, look, there's a lot of challenges that organizations are facing with respect to identifying risk across their global supply chains. And it's really impacting multiple different parts of the organization. It's not just something that trade compliance is accountable for. It's not just something strategic sourcing owns. It really is a new paradigm where organizations are having to think collectively and work in a collaborative fashion to try to address the regulatory challenges that they're facing, reputational risks and challenges that they're facing. And then the newest dimension is resiliency challenges. So are some of these businesses, sure, they're legal for us to work with, and yeah, they're not necessarily going to hurt our image and reputation, but if they're located in a floodplain that didn't used to exist, or they're dealing with some infrastructure challenges in their country, that business might not be able to serve you over the long term. So how are organizations trying to try to think about this more holistically? And it really is across those three dimensions of risk that I just talked about. But I think where we wanted to explore a little bit more today is, hey, regulatory risk, reputational risk, it's a bit of a blurry line sometimes, and it's becoming even more blurry now as government stakeholders from around the world are becoming a lot less prescriptive in how they identify third parties that are illegal or ill-advised to do business with. And so we touched on the UFLPA in the U.S. In our last conversation, and how there's a partial list of entities based in China that the U.S. government has said, we know these entities are dealing with forced labor in the Uyghur region, and we are going to preclude any U.S. businesses from importing goods from those entities. But the list is not exhaustive, and the regulations say it's not exhaustive. And so how does an organization now start to do its own due diligence? And this is a big shift. Over the past 20 years that I've been in the customs and the regulatory compliance space, for the longest time, entities or organizations would just say, hey, we'll look at all the government published lists that pertain to us. We'll screen all our third parties against those lists, and we'll be good to go. And unfortunately, policymakers are becoming a lot less prescriptive. And so I think it's creating due diligence challenges where organizations do need to work more collaboratively, as you said, Andy, to say, okay, what is our due diligence approach going to look like here, right? Like, how are we actually going to get to ground to understand if an entity that we're doing business with in China has any exposure to forced labor risk in the Uyghur region? And it's creating a huge amount of internal work for organizations to do that. And we really think this is a trend that's just going to continue.
Well, I will say this, Jackson, this is let me stop for a second to address our audience for just a moment. Folks, if you're listening to this, especially if you are an executive, a middle management and leader and whatnot, you need to be looking at what we're talking about and thinking of how to, maybe you might need to adjust or change your approach when you are vetting a new product to be, let's say, sold or added to your inventory of items to sell to clients, services and things of that nature. From a leadership perspective, you need to be looking at it from a standpoint of, all right, what changes? Because usually, as Jackson, as we were saying, you're going to have your purchasing. They're looking for bigger, better, faster, cheaper, whatever, as far as the cost of items. Your transportation logistics, they're just looking at, cycle times from point A to point B and all that. Compliance, is crossing the T's and dotting the I's. You have all these different things that are going on. You have your customer service folks that are, selling it. You've got your sales that are out there knocking doors. You've got all these different entities that are touching different elements of people, companies, and the products. But when it comes to vetting this, now I'm getting into, if you are in these departments, is you just said, we're talking about as far as collaborating now, government regulations are such that you need to have your purchasing or sourcing groups working with your compliance and working with your logistics and transportation and all that. That kind of effort does not just happen. It doesn't just say, well, what's going on? I'm looking at this or whatever. It needs to be an ongoing adjustment of day in and day out, procedures, processes, and things of that nature. And I guess as we're talking through this is that to do that, if you're going to be effective, the big question is, how do you implement something like that? Would that be a pretty good way to open this discussion up?
Yeah, I think so, Andy. And I'll share, I was speaking with one of our customers yesterday about this very topic, and it was a diverse group of stakeholders in the conversation. So we had our trade compliance team. We also had the information technology group. We had legal, we had operations, et cetera. And one of the stakeholders who worked in the risk management office was talking about how he's actually had to create an entire new SOP for sort of bespoke due diligence on potential third parties, right? So there's this essentially kind of clunky manual handoff process that happens where, okay, sourcing has identified what they believe to be exactly as you say, Andy, bigger, better, faster, cheaper. We think this is looking good. Trade compliance weighs in and say, okay, yeah, there's no particular regulatory restrictions that apply to the jurisdiction. The commodities involved are clean, et cetera. But now they're having this individual in the risk management office have to do manual research to try to understand the ownership structure of that organization, try to understand what their supply chain looks like. Okay, so who are their core tier one suppliers? Who are the tier one suppliers to their tier one suppliers? And it's essentially become a full-time job, manual job for this individual in risk management to be able to vet and at a high level. Like he's even saying, I don't have 100% confidence that the due diligence I'm doing here is actually going to tell us the whole story, because he's relying primarily on open source information, right? Like being able to uh, read media in the jurisdiction in question, government filings in the jurisdiction in question. And those of us who've worked in international business for years know that it's not like every country isn't like the United States in terms of the information that's available in terms of how companies are structured and who owns them and the type of work that they do with their stakeholders. So it's created a very significant internal operational burden for this additional level of due diligence to happen. It is collaborative and they're doing their level best to make it an effective approach. But you've got this person who now has practically got a new full-time job of trying to connect the dots on this next level of due diligence. And it's proving to be very challenging for them to scale up because, as I say, it's really one person who's kind of figured out how to do this on his own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and all right, so here's the scenario though, that when you're looking at trying to, shall we say, implement this, is that, as I was just saying, from a leadership perspective, would you recommend that a company's, you were talking about, you're talking to a client and whatnot, would you suggest that a high level executive pull in the department heads and sit down and talk through this a little bit? Or do you think that they need to do some kind of industry council type thing where they're pulling people from different organizations? Or, I mean, what do you recommend for the next step for somebody here?
Well, I think that it's a combination of those two approaches, Andy. And so, as we talked about in our first conversation, obviously the internal governance is a key element to set your organization up for success here. So whether it's the chief compliance officer, the chief legal officer, the CFO, et cetera, like someone who has the organization purview to be able to sort of make these conversations happen and holds people accountable to executing against what is determined to be the appropriate course of action. So I think that is a really important element of being able to tackle these challenges. But you also raise a good point, and we see this particularly in some of the industries that we work in that have been dealing with these challenges for a more extended period of time. So if we think about apparel organizations or retail organizations, footwear has had the spotlight on it in this type of thing for a long time. And there are a very significant number of mature industry-wide collaborative tables that have been trying to share best practices and lobby for appropriate supports from government for a number of years. And they've done really good work in terms of being able to educate the industry and create those learning forums where best practices can be shared and some of the challenges can be worked through in a collaborative way. But I think to sort of come back, Andy, as you're talking about, like, what's a leader to do? What's someone who's really been tasked with trying to figure this out at the organizational level? There are a lot of people, again, particularly if you're in some of those industries that have been dealing with this, you're not alone. There have been lots of learnings that have been developed and can be shared. I would say, though, that it's important to recognize that it's not going to necessarily be plug and play, right? So just because something has worked in one particular organization in one particular vertical, we can think about that from a principal perspective and say, hey, it's about aligned internal governance. It's about really tight relationships with our third-party partners, whether those are freight forwarders, customs brokers, any intermediaries that are helping enable our supply chain. Let's talk to our technology partners. So whether that's our ERP providers, whether that's our global trade management providers, our contract management providers, because one thing that I do think is perhaps a bit of an unexplored opportunity for success here is going to those established partners and saying, look, is there anything else that you can do here to help us address these challenges, right? And I think that's where we're getting brought into a lot of these conversations, is saying, look, we've been working with Descartes from a compliance perspective or a trade automation perspective for 15 years. What are you hearing from your customers? How are they addressing some of these challenges? And are there capabilities in your technology that we haven't explored that might be able to help us address this? And so I think that's perhaps the final piece of this is, it's not necessarily go out and find a new tool that's going to help you, whether it's with supply chain mapping, whether it's with enhanced due diligence. Let's start with the known quantity. Let's start with the technology that we're familiar with, that our people are trained on, that's provided by a partner we can trust and that we can rely on, and see if we can build on that rather than running off, spending a bunch of money, standing up a whole new solution or a whole new function, when in actual fact, you might be able to do a lot of good work with the tools that you already have at your disposal.
Well, excellent, excellent. So with that, though, as you're looking at, what about creating an incentive for these different entities to work together? Where would you, I know what I would suggest, but I mean, I'd like to hear from your perspective what how to get people bought into. Yeah, conceptually you go through it, but how would you, I guess, move people along to say, hey, I'm in purchasing. I need to be bought into what the compliance folks are looking at, or what logistics is looking at, or whatever. What do you recommend there?
Well, I think to the degree that it's possible, very senior leadership, whether it's the CEO, whether it's the chairperson of the board, whether it's some key leadership figure in the organization, puts a stake in the ground, either internally or, in best case scenario, externally, whether that's if they're a publicly traded organization, the CEO and the board say, we are committed to rooting out any forced labor risk in our supply chain. We are committed to establishing a transparent and sustainable supply chain. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we are successful. We're going to set very specific goals. We're going to be transparent with the public, with our customers, with our internal staff about the work that we're doing and the resources that we're allocating here. Obviously, aligned incentives are a key element in successful internal collaboration. So I'm not a compensation expert, but certainly anything that leadership can do to work with their people and culture or their human resource leadership team to say, hey, how are we going to make sure that we're incentivizing our people to work on this collaboratively, to prioritize it in the light of all of the other things that we're trying to do on a day-to-day basis? But I think the somewhat more straightforward thing are those stakes in the ground, like I say. And if you think about, there are a lot of companies that are putting their money where their mouth is on this, like very public statements of commitment from executive leaders, from governance leaders saying, we are absolutely committed to this. It's become a part of what their annual reports speak to. It has become a part of the metrics that the business reports on. If they are publicly traded, disclosures are becoming a much bigger thing. The SEC in the US has really started to make significant motions towards codifying in sustainability directives and the reporting obligations that publicly traded organizations are going to have to meet. So I think what a lot of smart companies are doing is getting out in front of this. And so the CEOs are recognizing that, hey, this is going to become a part of how I'm managed or how I'm evaluated in terms of how our organization is successful. And so I'd rather start figuring out how we're going to do this today before it's a legal requirement. And this is that, as we were talking about earlier, this is where that regulatory and reputational risk piece, where those lines really start to blur. And if we look back over the past 15 or 20 years, it was often the case where there would be negative news or there would be a perception of a particular entity, whether it was an international company or a government, where if there's smoke, there's fire. And the smoke would be, hey, look, there's an investigation that's been opened on this organization because they've been dumping pollution into local waterways, right? And so maybe regulations haven't caught up to them or lawmakers haven't caught up to them, but organizations that were proactive were able to see that canary in the coal mine and say, hey, we're going to have to start refactoring our supply chain to get away from the risk that we're likely to be exposed to once this organization is officially reprimanded from a legal or a regulatory perspective. And so I think there's very similar trends happening now. I talked about the sort of direction the SEC is heading in the US, but there are new supply chain and transparency directives in the EU that are speaking to, okay, not only do you have to do this, you have to disclose on an annual basis what you are doing as an organization to address things like human trafficking, forced labor, sustainability, et cetera. And so to try to tie this back, Andy, to the internal collaboration, the internal work that has to happen, one of the things companies are going to have to do is say, here's how our strategic sourcing group has changed their standard operating procedures to bring a heightened level of due diligence into our sourcing activities. Here are the changes that our logistics and supply chain group have brought with respect to the functioning of our supply chain, how we think about moving goods from point A to point B. Here's how our legal and regulatory affairs group has changed the way they work with stakeholders internally to start bringing more transparency and more accountability to our global supply chain. And so I think it is in every organization's best interest to get out in front of this. It's only a matter of time until the legal burden is going to become such that it's no longer negotiable. So better to start learning and start building the cultural change that your organization is going to have to navigate through so that you're ready when it inevitably becomes something that regulations compel your organization to do.
Jackson, I'm going to say that you're hitting on something that some folks may not have really thought about. So let me throw this out to, again, from our audience perspective. You know, we've talked about trying to pull people together on, vetting new suppliers, new products, doing different things like that. You're looking at, your end customers, your transportation, all that. There is an element here of pulling together to try and say, is this party worth doing business with, or are there some red flags? That's one thing. But there's a whole nother element. So even just outside the international trade legal side of things, there's going to be just a general company legal perspective that is probably needing to get involved here, as well as probably your audit groups that come to mind. So as I'm thinking through this, your general counsels of different companies should be giving some consideration to establishing some kind of some responsibility within their organization to say, look, you need to go through and pull these entities together, have these groups properly documented their methodologies, the findings on the, all right, we're using this person based on what now? It just wasn't just the cheapest price. So what I see in that would be something that, the need, as you just said, from a legal perspective, somewhere down the road, you get hit with some litigation here. It's like, you got to be able to back this up. So in getting ahead of this is one of those things that I can see. You probably need to start looking at this being smart, especially if you're a large company, and they'll start there and they'll go down the road. But here's something else to give some thought to. And now I'm going to, folks, I'm not doing this to try and promote one company over another, but I'm just going to say, Descartes, you guys have all kinds of systems. So in the process of this, as we're talking through this, would this be something that, from an information perspective, that, there are systems that like y'all have that could not only house the history and the documentation process of what you're doing, but also be able to share that within the company to say, I need to look at this to see if anything's going on a year, 2 year, 3 years down the road or something?
Yep, absolutely. And that's a big part of our value proposition in terms of not only making the right decision support content available, right? So being able to look at third party risk, being able to look at commodity risk, whether that's from an HTS perspective, ECCN, export controls, all of those types of things. So the actual ability to access that information in a usable way, parse it out, do the right level of analysis in terms of how it pertains to your company, but then maintaining that single source of truth, right? About, hey, here is the information we've cross-referenced. Here's the internal workflow that happened in terms of, hey, we got engineering to weigh in on this. We got sourcing to weigh in on this. We got legal and regulatory affairs. We got trade compliance. Like, being able to document all of those touch points in the decision-making process is essential. And it's not just going to help you if there's questions internally, but in the event that there is a government audit or some delays on imported or exported goods where you need to be able to demonstrate reasonable care, having that audit trail, having that proof point around, look, we have exercised every degree of due diligence that we can on this transaction is essential. And that concept of reasonable care, which everyone who's worked in customs is familiar with, like, I think that's a good starting point as well to be able to say, and just as a note, this is why trade compliance is such a great part of this process inside of internal organizations. Is this is what trade compliance has always been, right? Cross-referencing vast amounts of data, connecting the dots in terms of what it means from an international movement perspective, not just of goods, but of capital, of services. That expertise, that familiarity with that level of due diligence, trade compliance is exceptionally well positioned to show the rest of the organization an effective way to do this. And so reasonable care as the starting point can really, again, help to coalesce everyone in the organization to say, it's not enough that we do it. We have to have it documented how we do it, and we got to be able to show our work in the event of a suboptimal incident externally.
Well, that's where you made the statement of what I was, it's the exercise of showing due diligence that gives the opportunity, one, to help pull the different groups within your company together, but also maybe highlight some weak links in there that's going to require input from other departments to say, there's not enough information here. We need, where did you get these folks? How did you find them? Did somebody knock on our door, send you information, or did you just happen to find them? What was going on? I will say, this is one, again, if you are an executive, a leader, a business owner, your compliance group is going to be that shiny penny in your arsenal of departments if you use it. And, just like anything else, when you have change, a penny may not seem much value, but at the time, it's like you pull that out and listen, that is phenomenal. And it is when you're tapping the legal aspect of things and regulatory compliance and all of that, that's one that you need to have some discussions with, maybe one-on-one, to say, what are you seeing? What concerns you? What from a owner to a compliance person, asking that person, what keeps you up at night? What scares you to death when you come in the door and all that? And when you hear the responses back going, well, I'm getting all these products that are coming in. We're adding so many new products that we're not having enough time to properly vet them. It's like, well, do you need to look at making sure that the group is involved in a timely manner, or do you need to add staffing in this area, or you need to collaborate and pull something together? But I mean, once you talk along those lines of an executive or something that goes along the lines of looking at it saying, should they be reaching out to somebody there in the compliance arena?
Absolutely. And I think we are seeing, and this started with the Russia-Ukraine situation where, and again, everybody who's been around trade compliance for a while knows, like, it's the shadowy group. They work behind the scenes. Nobody actually knows what they do except tell us that we can't do business with this particular company or country, or we can't ship that product out yet because it hasn't been classified appropriately, or we're still trying to understand what the trade agreement implications might be. And so in historic context, trade compliance has been a bit of a friction point in the business. And I think what happened with the Russia-Ukraine situation is all of a sudden the C-suite was calling the trade compliance group and saying, what's our exposure here? Like, how do we navigate through the flurry of sanctions, the flurry of export controls? And I think that was really a learning moment for executive leaders inside big global companies of, hey, our trade compliance group is a gem. Like, there's a wealth of expertise. There's a wealth of knowledge in our trade compliance team that can help us protect the business much more broadly. And so that opportunity to demonstrate value, to demonstrate capability, I think has begun this trajectory of organizations starting to recognize that the trade compliance function is actually an enabler of business growth, a value center, not a cost center. And ultimately, these new regulatory requirements, the expansion of reputational due diligence, the trade compliance function is a leverage point here. Because, as I mentioned, that expertise, the familiarity with detailed due diligence, they really can be a leadership group inside the organization to demonstrate how this type of work can be done, how we can maintain the appropriate visibility into how we're executing, how we can report on well, how we can interface with regulators and other external stakeholders. And so I really think this is the new era of trade compliance as a strategic enabler of business success. And I think it's high time that executive leaders inside of big global organizations are recognizing the value of trade compliance.
Well, and that's one thing too, that you're hitting on something again with such a valuable resource. There are other things of, if you want to know what is going on in for your products from a competitive perspective. It's like, we're importing certain things, trade statistics come in, so valuable from, the compliance. They may not have them readily available, but it's like, if you're looking for, and you have an interest, are there any other sources for this product, or who else is bringing it in, or who seems to be the top importer of this kind of product? Give your compliance people time to do the research, and they can come back, because they could probably track down maybe not the specific company that's importing, but they can track down where the origin is of some of these same products that you're bringing in. So that's, it's again a valuable resource. Here, and let me come back around though, is all of this kind of stuff, as we're talking about it from a statistical perspective. That's where, the software, you cannot do it manually in today's world and be effective. I mean, it's just, there's too much information, too many products, too many different things. That's where I guess I come back around to companies like yourself. I know we've had a competitor of yours on that has talked about it and gone through. When you're trying to vet entities to say, do we want to do business with them or these products and all that, you've got to do that in an automated fashion because you can't keep up with it. There's so much. But then tying that in and integrating the software into other types of software, be it your purchase order, be it your accounting system, be it your transportation system and logistics, all of that, there needs to be some kind of a vision. So even with your IT group, needs to get with your compliance to say, hey, we need to be able to have an audit trail of products so that, you have something to hit support. Where did this come from? And you start reversing the role and tracking it down. Even, and I mentioned this earlier, the audit department. You can have people come together from your purchasing, some of your compliance, your transportation, logistics, your customer service, all these different entities, your accounting. Get your audit group, your corporate audit group, whether it's a third party outsourced or whether it's in-house, and go in and check out what you're being told as far as these recap reports and different things, and have them validate, no, this is legitimate, that looks good, or there seems to be a weak link some here. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point to think about. Especially larger organizations frequently have those internal audit resources. And I I know there are a number of companies that I've worked with over the years where trade compliance is actually rolls up to the internal auditor, right? And so I think the similarities in the discipline really do create leverage points where you can get that sort of, it's not, doesn't have to be antagonistic. Like, nobody likes an auditor knocking on their door, whether it's internal or external. But if it's really presented in the spirit of internal collaboration and we are trying to learn from each other in terms of how we strengthen our organization's overall approach to regulatory, reputational, and resiliency risk, like, it doesn't have to be a difficult collaboration. It can actually be done in the spirit of learning and the spirit of strengthening the overall organization. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Well, and also I will say that from personal experience, I look at this, but I will say, if you're a small company, it would be worth the money to outsource, have somebody come in and just spend $500,000, $2,000, whatever. And depending on how big you are and how extensive, but it's like, just put yourself at ease and your own staff at ease. Double check things. Let them go through from a neutral perspective, and they can look at it and say, you have some areas over here to look. That'd be great. But here's the thing. Any kind of audits, any kind of efficient ways of managing data and all that, if you've got some good systems, good software systems and all of that, it would be a way to minimize the cost of double checking on these things. And so that when you do have somebody that may need to knock on the door of a department or go out into the field and check something out, they're not out there digging through manual pieces of paper. They're looking for a few things. And so your T&E costs will go down because they don't have to be out there as long. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think, and this is a little bit of a trailer for our next conversation where we'll talk in more detail about how some technology really can help automate these core steps of due diligence and compliance oversight. But I think people underestimate how mature certain technology solutions in our space have become, and how organizations that have been at the cutting edge of, hey, how can we get a better degree of automation, more visibility, a better audit trail, et cetera, have proven that we don't necessarily need hundreds more people to be able to do some of this work. We can leverage existing IT infrastructure that we've invested in to help us strengthen our overall approach to compliance and risk management. So I look forward in our next conversation to talking about how some of that looks in more detail, but suffice it to say, I think a lot of your listeners will be hopefully pleasantly surprised to learn how much impact technology can have in this area.
Well, folks, I got to say, we can keep talking because we're getting into some really interesting things, but basically on this, hopefully this discussion has stimulated your brain to think through this. If you are a high level executive, an owner, a small business owner, doesn't matter on that. Look at the approach on how, again, as simplistic as it is, vetting new suppliers, vetting new products, vetting even your customers of people you're doing business with, how the goods are coming in and who you're doing, who your vendors are, to the point of, again, talking internally and pulling people together and using the compliance as a resource and whatnot. And out of all of that, this is one of those things that I am looking, Jackson, I'm going to tell you, I think the next go round, we've talked about things in the past at a higher level. This is one of those who's like literally, how do you apply automation, if you will, in the process, or technology into the process to automate processes that will make you more effective, keep you compliant, show you where the red flags are, and basically enable you to say, I got to take some action. I got to make a policy change. I got to do something here to make sure we're fine, or, hey, we're in good shape. Let's continue on. But it's not a one-shot deal either. It's got to be an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Jackson, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Lalo, I guess we've come to the end of another good show here, and I really am looking forward to the next series on this one. This is a good series.
Thank you, Jackson. I know this is building up towards, just different areas that we need to look at, and I really have been enjoying this a lot as well. So thank you all, and we hope our audience also has, like you say, Andy, gets a little nugget out of this, and and we can, we can hear from you, and you let us know. We need to come up with a way to better communicate with our audience, I guess, outside of LinkedIn.
Oh, I wish there's a little bit more interactive at times. Yeah, it's like maybe we need to do some more live webinar type podcast or something.
Yeah. We might come up with something like that. But anyway, well, thank you though. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next episode.
Folks, have a great day, and until next time, take care.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.